Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister this week made new proposals to the European Union for Brexit, although the auguries are not good, with the European Commission tonight saying member states had agreed there is no basis for an agreement. So the question is posed again, how can he leave on October the 31st and obey the law which compels him to conclude a deal or seek an extension? Today, his lawyers seem to tell Scotland's highest court he would cave in and delay Brexit. Paul McNamara reports.
Let's get Brexit done by October the 31st.
Come what may.
Come what may.
Do or die.
Come what may. Do or die. Come what may.
He's said it again and again.
Will we definitely have left by November?
By November, you bet.
And he said it most emphatically last month.
Can you make a promise today to the British public that you will not go back to Brussels and ask for another delay to Brexit?
Yes.
And sorry.
I can.
And would you
I'd rather be dead in a ditch.
But would he? Despite all the rhetoric, the evidence put before a Scottish court today suggests the Prime Minister might just be preparing to delay Brexit. And in this court, because campaigners are seeking a ruling to force the PM to comply with the law. What these judges were presented with? Government papers that said Boris Johnson will send a letter to the EU asking for a Brexit delay if no deal is agreed by the 19th of October.
It appears to be that the Prime Minister thinks his role is that of an ambassador for the country in the sense of being an honest man sent of God to lie to foreigners for the good of the country. But unfortunately, the Prime Minister is not naturally an honest man, and he hasn't only been lying to foreigners on this point.
The Prime Minister maintains there will be no delay and the law will be complied with. Both simply aren't possible, says the man behind the court action.
The purpose of this action is to make clear to the Prime Minister that if he does not do what he has undertaken, what he has said to the court that he will do, there will be personal, penal consequences for him. This is not a Prime Minister who we can trust. We know this because he is telling Parliament one thing and he's telling the court something else, and those two statements cannot be reconciled with one another.
Not so, said a Downing Street source today. The government will comply with the law designed to block no deal, they said, adding the law can be interpreted in different ways. The source went further though. But, they said, the government is not prevented by the Act from doing other things that cause no delay, including other communications, both private and public. People will have to wait and see how this is reconciled. The government, they said, is making its true position on a delay known privately in Europe, and this will become public soon. And by this afternoon, the Prime Minister was talking by tweet. New deal or no deal, but no delay. No detail either. And detail is what this man wants. Leo Varadkar is far from convinced Boris Johnson's new Brexit proposal is passable, either in Europe or even possibly in the UK.
It's not abundantly clear to us that there's any agreement that will secure a majority in the House of Commons, but we have to work towards that, and we're willing to do so.
Tonight, the European Commission said member states agreed the UK proposals do not provide a basis for concluding an agreement. So the question now, just where does the Prime Minister go next?
Now, Boris Johnson has always refused to explicitly say he will send the letter, which the law says he must, requesting a Brexit extension if he doesn't get a deal. He famously said he'd rather be, quote, dead in a ditch. Well, finally today, the government was forced to admit in a Scottish court that he would ask for the extension. But Downing Street quickly tried to minimise the letter's importance, with the Prime Minister repeating his mantra that the UK will still somehow leave the EU on October the 31st. Meanwhile, leaving with a deal seemed to slip further away tonight after the EU rejected Mr Johnson's latest offer.
There are no circumstances in which I will ask Brussels to delay. We are coming out of the EU on October the 31st. I'd rather be dead in a ditch.
Would he really turn his back on all the times he said it, the one pledge that got him through that Downing Street door? Well, today, in a fresh court case in Scotland, the Prime Minister suggested he would break his promise rather than break the law and seek the Brexit extension MPs have demanded. Papers submitted by his legal team stating he will send a letter to the EU by no later than the 19th of October 2019.
So there's a bit of a bombshell in court, actually, because he's telling members of the Conservative Party, he's telling the House of Commons, he's telling all of us in media interviews that come what may, we will leave on the 31st of October. And either he is not telling the truth to Parliament, to us, or he is not telling the truth to the court. He can't be telling the truth to everybody.
If I'm lucky enough to defeat Boris Johnson in that final two...
He didn't beat Boris Johnson to become Prime Minister, but have MPs like Rory Stewart now won the Brexit battle. Today, he quit the Conservatives to stand as an independent Mayor of London, confident Boris Johnson can't go his own way when it comes to the law.
Do you trust the Prime Minister to mean what he says here, or do you think there's some other trick that he's got up his sleeve?
I don't think he has another trick up his sleeve. I think when he says, I'm leaving by the 31st of October, do or die, he's talking about what he wants to do. But I don't think he can do it, because I think the law is the law. And we still live in a country where the Prime Minister will obey the law.
Except this evening, Boris Johnson was back to his old mantra, tweeting, "New deal or no deal, but no delay." Tonight, the EU said the Prime Minister's proposals don't provide the basis for a new agreement, even if earlier Ireland sounded optimistic.
I mean, I think it is possible to get a deal this month. I believe that the British Prime Minister wants to get a deal this month. We will certainly work to that time frame if the British position evolves, and we want to be helpful on that. And I don't think we should give up on that.
As for what the Prime Minister's willing to give up, tonight Downing Street was keeping the door closed on its plan. A quick glimpse of his car, but still no real sense of where Boris Johnson's heading.
So, Paul, the question is there a master plan, or is it, as Rory Stewart says, that it's just more rhetoric than anything else?
Well, look, Raggy, when the Prime Minister walked into Downing Street, one of the first things he did was set up a Brexit countdown clock. He set it to October the 31st. Is he really going to want to wind it forward by 3 months? I guess the answer depends on which oath you think he's going to honour, the one he effectively made in court today or the one that he has made repeatedly to the British people. I suspect that the truth actually lies somewhere in the middle. It's quite malleable here. Certainly, listening to what Downing Street was saying in private today, they're suggesting that they will adhere by the Benn Act, they will send this letter asking for a delay, but it doesn't stop them, they think, from doing other things like writing other letters saying they don't really want a delay, or perhaps persuading EU leaders not to grant a delay. I think overall, though, the strategy here is just to put up as much of a struggle as possible, because really they're thinking of fighting something else, namely a general election. Yeah, of course. And if Boris Johnson really has to go for this delay, he wants to make sure it does not look as though it is in any way his fault. For the next few days, though, the emphasis is on getting a deal rather than leaving without a deal. There'll be a few meetings, we think, next week, potentially with EU leaders. Boris Johnson, though, has had his mantra all week at conference saying, let's get Brexit done.
Yeah.
We still don't know tonight when or how.
This is going to run and run. Paul, thank you very much indeed.
It turns out that Boris Johnson's sound and fury insisting we would Brexit on October the 31st, deal or no deal, is not quite as it seems. In fact, not at all. A government document submitted to the Court of Session in Scotland confirms the Prime Minister will send a letter asking for a Brexit delay if no deal is agreed by the 19th of this month. But a senior Downing Street source said the government is not prevented by the Act from doing other things that cause no delay, including other communications, private and public. And tweeting this afternoon, Boris Johnson appeared uncowed, saying, "New deal or no deal, but no delay." So what's he up to? Here's James Clayton.
Boris Johnson joked earlier this week.
If Parliament were a school, Ofsted would be shutting it down.
Tonight, it's the PM's plans to leave the EU on the 31st of October that are in special measures.
We are coming out of the EU on October the 31st, come what may.
Boris Johnson's preference is to leave with a deal. This week, though, saw collective eyebrows raised in Dublin and Brussels at Boris Johnson's new proposals.
We don't see it as a serious alternative for the backstop.
Plan B, leaving without a deal, has never been so important to number 10. That made what happened here in this Edinburgh court today all the more unexpected.
Today has been the most dramatic day I've ever had in court. It was absolutely extraordinary.
Our starting point.
Extraordinary in part because after weeks of evasive answers to questions on whether the government would actually send a letter requesting an extension, the government in court today finally said that if it came down to it, it would write that letter. Game, set and match then to those trying to thwart a no deal. Well, perhaps. But still tonight the government maintains that no deal can be pushed through. How? Well, ultimately the Benn Act is contingent on one quite important thing, that the EU 27 agrees to an extension. It would only take one country to veto it. And that's where the focus is headed. In April, as part of the UK's extension, the British government agreed to be constructive and responsible members and to cooperate with the EU. Sources inside the government have told Newsnight that if an extension had to be requested, one option would be to simply say that if such a request were granted, the UK would no longer be a constructive member. It could not pick a commissioner, for example, or block the EU's budget. The question then is whether by doing that, the government would be frustrating the Benn Act.
A Prime Minister who seeks to cause the EU not to grant an extension by threatening a lack of cooperation, threatening disruption, threatening not to nominate EU commissioners is, in my opinion, and I am a Queen's Counsel, a Prime Minister who is frustrating the intention of Parliament.
But one Brexit-supporting lawyer argues that the courts would struggle to stop the government.
Courts would find it very difficult to intervene in that, even if it might be argued that it is frustrating it, because essentially that would mean that the government would have to be told exactly what it could and could not do, and micromanaged by the courts. I find it difficult to see how the courts could do that, or would want to.
Tonight it's reported that the EU has rebuffed UK requests to intensify negotiations over the weekend. On both fronts, getting Brexit done by the 31st of October is looking increasingly difficult.
James Clayton, well, now we're going to discuss the week in politics with Ed Miliband's former advisor Aisha Hazariki, the former special advisor Sajid Javid, Salma Shah, and Eurasia Group's Munchaba Rahman. But first, we're going to consider today's developments in the case against the government in the Scottish Court of Session. For that, I'm joined by former Supreme Court Justice Lord Sumption and the QC and Brexit Party prospective parliamentary candidate for Salisbury, Julian Malins. Good evening to you all. Lord Sumption, first of all, the government says it's going to abide by the Benn Act. Boris Johnson said he'll still be leaving New Deal, no deal on the 31st. How can these be reconcilable?
Well, he may expect the EU to refuse the extension, or he may think he's going to get a deal.
Let's suggest that the EU is not going to refuse an extension and that he doesn't get a deal. Is there any way around the letter that was revealed by the existence of the letter that was revealed by the court?
No. And the Prime Minister has submitted to the inevitable, as he was always bound to do. And if he gives a statement to the court that he is going to comply with the law and send the letter, then I've no doubt that he will do it. It must have been a very considered decision to make that statement. I can't see that he's going to resile from it now. Do
you think they realise it can be made public?
Of course. Everything that happens in an open court can be made public.
So, Julian Malins, let's say court meeting on Monday. Just say he does leave without a deal on the 31st. What would be the sanction on Boris Johnson?
Well, I don't know how he's going to be able to do that, because he's got to obey the law. He's got to ask for an extension unless there is an agreement reached by all parties beforehand, which seems unlikely. If he asks for an extension, I'm personally sure it'll be granted, but on condition not that there is a general election, but that there is a second referendum. That's what's going to happen.
That's what's going to happen. I mean, the idea, of course, because you're a Brexit Party candidate,
Yes.
that it kind of be music to your ears, that there was going to be a problem, would only, you would think, perhaps add to your vote level.
It's not music to the Brexit Party's ears that a Prime Minister or anybody in the country disobeys the law. And the idea that he would ignore the Benn Act and not send a request for an extension is preposterous. It would put the Prime Minister in conflict again with the judiciary and probably also with the legislature. So that's not a Brexit. We don't want a clean break Brexit by an unlawful means.
No. But Lord Sumption, Downing Street is talking about a communication, private or public. There's something. They've got something up their sleeve.
Well, we don't know that.
If
there's an awful lot of bluff going on.
Yes, but if Boris Johnson didn't send the letter, could the court send the letter?
Yes.
If the court sends the letter, Boris Johnson's deemed not to have given in, as it were. The court has overridden what he wanted to do, which the people would say that are pro-Brexit. Look at that. Boris Johnson standing up for it and the court has interfered.
Well, that's possible. I'm not here to predict what Boris Johnson's sales pitch is going to be, but the letter will be sent on his behalf.
Well, luckily I've got 3 other people who are going to predict what the sales pitch might be, and so let's move on. Salma, first of all, Boris Johnson's been caught out again, hasn't he?
I think what's happened is if we go back to the beginning and try and understand why he took no deal to such an extent, do or die 31st of October, initially it was about having a negotiating hand, however strong or weak that might have turned out to be, or however strong or weak you think it is. It was being able to leverage something in order to get a deal. I think once the Benn Act went through and they tried to go for a general election, which also didn't happen, they recalibrated and then tried to make it somehow electorally beneficial, which is he's not the person trying to frustrate Brexit, the Conservative government is not frustrating Brexit, opposition parties are, and he can actually go on to an election having done his best to try and get to a conclusion.
A reasonable narrative, Aisha?
Well, good luck with that message. You know, you don't go in all guns blazing saying do or die. It wasn't just talking about tweaking the backstop, it was getting rid of the backstop. You know, the language got even more intense over the last couple of weeks. And then suddenly, you know, yet again, he's been sort of found out with by these court papers. But at Conservative Party conference just this week, senior advisers were briefing away merrily. We are not signing that letter.
Yeah.
We are absolutely not signing that letter, and we are leaving on the 31st. I don't care what the law says. Happy to see you all in court. I mean, people were joking about Boris Johnson being the martyr in the clink, people sending him cakes. You know, I mean, we're just so far removed from what these guys are rightly saying about the law.
Well,
it's ridiculous.
We want a clean break Brexit, but not so as to bring our government into disrepute.
Further disrepute.
Absolutely. You've just been questioning the Chinese ambassador. I have a member of Chambers in Hong Kong. How do we confront China over their behaviour in Hong Kong when the world looks to see that the Supreme Court has found our own Prime Minister acting anti-democratically?
We've got a situation now where Boris Johnson was meant to be on a whistle-stop tour of Europe. We were told he's going to meet Angela Merkel today. It's all stop and no whistle. I mean, nobody seems to want to see him this weekend.
The negotiations are stuck in Brussels. The government came forward with new proposals on Wednesday. There are lots of gaps. Negotiators have been poring over the detail over the last few days. And the government has now agreed to a degree of alignment for Northern Ireland, but there's a question about how those arrangements will be governed. Europe has big problems with that. And of course on customs, with a border on the island of Ireland, and that's a problem.
So these are simply the proposals just now. There's no, people are talking about a deal. It's only a proposal. To what extent is a proposal popular in Europe? What would you say? What would you give the chances of it?
I would say 0 to 5%, probably closer to 0, unless the government moves quite substantially towards the EU position on customs. I don't think there can be an agreement.
We should say tonight, of course, we asked for the government and they didn't put up. On the question of changes to this proposal, the Stormont veto, tell me about that.
I mean, I think the Europeans believe there is a role for the institutions, the executive and the assembly. The question is how those rules are designed, what's the involvement of those institutions. So I think the principle of their involvement, the Europeans agree to. The bigger problem, Kirsty, is customs.
Yeah.
Unless the UK agrees that Northern Ireland remains in the EU customs territory, there will not be an agreement. There's no way around that question. You can't fudge this issue of the Irish border, and there's nothing, I think, that we're seeing on the UK side that suggests Boris Johnson is going to make that concession.
Now, the Daily Telegraph is running with a story tomorrow morning that Johnson pins his hopes on a Hungary veto for Brexit delay. I mean, there's no sign that there's not going to be an extension granted.
Again, I think, the likelihood of Hungary or another member state vetoing an extension are close to zero. They've got lots of business they have to advance in the EU. Why are they going to do Boris Johnson a favour, jeopardise their own standing with the other 26? I think that's highly, highly unlikely.
Lawrence Sumption, just coming back to the kind of legal position, what's going to happen in the courts on Monday? What are they going to be looking at?
Well, they're going to be listening to the rest of the application to try and get orders from the Scottish court to make the Prime Minister do what he says he's going to do anyway. How useful that exercise is, I leave to you to work out.
But if he doesn't do it and the courts do it, and you say, of course, it's perfectly legal if the courts do it, if he doesn't do it, having said he would do it, could he be in contempt of court?
Only if the court makes an order. But I wouldn't have thought the court is likely to make an order if he says that he's going to do what they want to make him do anyway.
So we're now in a situation where we're heading for an election at some point. Aisha, there's absolutely no sign of Jeremy Corbyn again.
What do you mean in terms
Well, I haven't seen him around. We don't hear from him this week.
To be fair to him, he doesn't really need to do very much, just looking at sort of where it's been the Tory party conference week. But the one thing that is absolutely clear is that the numbers are still going to be very, very tight for the Prime Minister. And as you correctly said, this is not a proposal yet. This is still a proposal. It's not a deal. The only thing that may happen is that the EU might say, look, we'll grant you a deal if you make further concessions, for example, on the customs union. If that happens, that is just Theresa May's deal with the blonde wig on it. I cannot see the ERG going for it. I cannot see the DUP going for it. Jeremy Corbyn has...
You could see a small smattering of Labour MPs going for it.
But remember, the Labour Party will whip against it. You're looking at a small number of Labour MPs. Yes, there's a group being led by Stephen Kinnock. They're not over the line yet. Remember, this is a big deal for Labour MPs to throw the Prime Minister, who is imperilled, a lifeline, a significant political lifeline. That's a big step for Labour MPs. There are also deselections going on in the Labour Party. So remember, there's going to be a lot of internal pressure on these Labour MPs.
But before Salma, Theresa May couldn't get it through Parliament, but she could get it through Europe. Of course, the other way around at the moment. But if the EU looks at the numbers and thinks that Boris Johnson might get it through, would they then tweak their position?
So, actually, I would look to Muchtamer to tell me whether that is possible. But I do agree with the analysis that the Commission is not blind to what's happening in the UK Parliament. And I would slightly disagree with you, Aisha, on the point that the ERG will not move on this, because we're now in a situation where enough Brexiteers actually fear losing Brexit altogether and think that perhaps they can wear it.
They are not going to be happy with the customs union. Yeah. That is a really big red line.
They'll lose the DUP. They'll lose the DUP in the customs union completely.
Well, yes, but depending on how the negotiations turn out.
Whether there's a theoretical majority in the Commons is almost irrelevant from Europe's perspective, because this is a deal that they believe undermines peace and stability on the island of Ireland and the functioning and the integrity of their internal market. So whether or not Boris can demonstrate a majority for this deal, from their perspective, is frankly irrelevant.
And we're in a situation where there may be an extension grant or whatever, but he's got to come up with something within the next 13 days.
Well, ought we just to be looking at the next 13 days? Johnson's real leverage with the EU is the prospect that he might win a general election in November or whenever, with the result that he can get Parliament's approval to leave without a deal. And if that happens, then there will be the hardest of hard borders on the island of Ireland. That's the real leverage.
That's real leverage.
I mean, I'm a parliamentary candidate, so I would like an election. But when I look to see how an election is going to come, it requires 2/3 of the House to vote for it. They're not going to vote for it very quickly because half of them will lose their seats. Or to bring down the government and be unable to form another government. Well, they'll love to form another government, even if it's only with a majority of 2 or 3. I can't see this election, which everybody's talking about. It won't happen anytime soon. That's my view.
Thank you all very much indeed.